Okay, let's join together in prayer. Loving God, we are grateful for this group. We're grateful for the friendships that have formed. We're grateful for the conversations we have that not only are edifying in our minds, but also strengthening us in our faith. And we ask that this evening you would help us to be very attentive to your holy presence with us, that you would share with us some of your wisdom, and that we would each find some way to grow closer to you and to be more faithful in following Jesus. We lift the prayer to you in his name and in the power of your Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we are on Mark. Oh, and so Alan, Rob is not well, so I'm filling in tonight. So
I'm sorry to hear that.
I didn't find out until 1 o'clock today, which was, an hour before the 2 o'clock. And I had to drive into town, so I haven't really prepared for our Bible study. So if there are questions that I don't know the answers to or don't have any insight to share on it, I promise that I would get back to people. I might not be here next week. Hopefully Rob will be back, but I will share some responses that we have from that. But anyway, so we're in Mark 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 today, if we get that far. So let's start on chapter 8. I personally was really enjoying chapter 8. If you kind of start with verse 1 and scroll down, you see the feeding of 4,000. And then the next story is about the demand for a sign. And I was saying how wonderful it is to do this Bible study like this, right? Where, like, when you're reading these scriptures, probably throughout the week, you're thinking, oh, that's a familiar scripture. Oh, I've heard that story before, right? And so, we would have preached, your pastors would have preached on these pericopes, but not all in one go, right? They would preach on one topic one time and another time. But when you see it all in a row, it's hilarious. So it starts out, Jesus feeds 4,000, and the very next thing is people demand a sign. And you see,
what are we just doing?
what do we just do, right? And then they get in the boat, they start to go across. The next is the yeast of the Pharisees. So they start to go across, and Jesus says, you need to be really careful about the yeast of the Pharisees. And they're all listening, going, it's because we forgot to bring bread with us. And he's like, don't you remember we just fed 5,000? Do you think I'm really worried about bread? Like, oh my gosh. And that last line in that particular story, verse 21, and then he said to them, do you not yet understand? It's like, really? Oh my goodness. I just thought, until you read this, just read whole chapters like this, you don't get that wonderful human aspect, right? You hear a story about Jesus feeds 5,000, and we preach a message about that. You hear a story about beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, and we preach a sermon about that. You hear a demand for a sign. But when you read it all together, then you go, oh my gosh, that changes everything, doesn't it? Like, I fed 5,000, give us a sign. But what? Oh, he's saying these things because we didn't bring bread. I just here. Come on, people. So I just loved it. I thought it was wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful passages. So I was having fun with that. What other kinds of things did you guys pick up on in chapter 8?
And he took off his the comment, you've referred to it already, but it is typical of the disciples' level of understanding or misunderstanding. After going through a description of the feeding of the 5,000 and the 12 baskets left over, he said, do you still not get it?
Right. Yeah.
And in large measure, they never did until the end.
That's right. For me, when I was growing up and we had, we're learning this. I always thought that those first disciples were like heroes, right? Like they were better than the rest of us doing this disciple stuff, right?
It was a long day. I had x-rays.
Who's talking?
I had a 2:00 appointment in the office.
All right, that helped. Okay. So, but when I read these stories like these, there was a point in my lifetime when suddenly I, was reading it as an adult and I went, wait, these aren't superheroes. These are just average people like me, like missing the point, like me, right? And look what God was able to do with them. They weren't like spectacular, exceptionally bright people or something. The difference between them and other people was simply that they said yes.
Just another example of how God can make good use of the less desirable raw material.
Which would be right.
Well, so, there is Judas, there's that. So that's kind of
well, you know what? You almost can hear the exasperation in Jesus's voice in Mark. And I think part of it, even more than the other gospels, because it's like, it jumps right in and it's boom, 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 whether it's a parable or this, it's like, but I mean, for me, the disciples are very human. And yeah, I didn't want them to be superheroes, right? So, you feel it is very comforting and it's okay. We are all called, right? So, yeah, I mean, I kind of like that. It's almost, you could chuckle and poor Jesus is like, oh, really? Come on. Time's a wasting here, he feels like he's running toward his death. And the disciples were like, what? Yeah. So human, so us.
Yeah, I like you saying so us, because I was just thinking of all the times that I'm sure Jesus has rolled his eyes and thrown up his hands at something I've done and said. But thinking about those disciples, how many healings did they witness? How many, people brought back to life did they witness? And they didn't stay awake to support Jesus the night after they had the Last Supper and he wanted to pray, and they couldn't even stay awake to be with him.
Well, to be fair, they had at least 4 glasses of wine, so.
Probably, but I'm sure they're used to that.
The Seder meal required you to drink 4 full glasses, so.
Yeah. Wow.
And then go out at night and sit there quietly and pray. I think most people would fall asleep.
Well, I didn't know about the 4 glasses, so that does put a different light on the story, or on the thought.
And that's one of the things that's, for us Protestants, particularly Methodists who grow up teetotaling kinds of people, we don't drink wine and we don't really talk about it very much. But when it tells the story and it says he took the final cup of the celebration, because in the midst of the celebration, there's specific times when you drink a cup. This is the cup, and then you drink that cup. And then this is the cup, and then this is the cup, and then the final cup. And each cup had a different meaning. And so when it says he took the final cup, we just go, okay, he took, it was the last cup. But no,
it
was a specific
sip.
Cup. It had specific, no, you drank the whole thing. Yeah. When I went to the Jewish community that have been using the Methodist church in the community where I was living, they invited us all to a Seder. And they said, oh, it's not wine tablecloth, you didn't do it right. Because by the end of the meal after drinking, somebody's going to knock the glass over, right? So if you didn't spill wine on the tablecloth, you didn't do it right.
Oh, back in Iowa, I served a church that observed a Seder every year, but they sure didn't use wine.
That's not a real Seder, but it's our adaptation, right? Yeah.
There was another kind of a funny kind of a healing story in here. Jesus seems to use saliva a lot to do stuff, and I just think that's kind of funny. And right after the story about the was it the fourth out, the yeast of the Pharisees, that
Mhm.
story. Right after that, he goes to the blind man, or the blind man's brought to him, and then he takes the blind man like out of the city, which is kind of funny. Why not just do it there? And then he spits in the guy's eyes and puts his hand on it. And then a really funny thing happens. Jesus asked the guy, well, did this work? Do you see anything? Like, how many times has Jesus basically waved his hand and said, go home, you're healed, and don't tell anybody, or, because your faith has made you well, and he's actually asking the guy, did this work?
Okay.
The guy says, yeah, not quite. It's kind of like you're looking through your eyelashes, everything's kind of like a vertical kind of a thing. And then Jesus,
doesn't the original scripture say he was blind from birth?
That's a different passage.
Oh,
yeah.
And
I was
then
going to
Jesus,
wonder how he was able to know what trees look like.
yeah.
Doesn't get that one in John, which is our next gospel.
And then Jesus has to do some more stuff. He has to put his hands on the guy's eyes again. But then it says his eyes were opened. And I'm kind of like, well, so if my eyes were not open, I wouldn't be able to see in either. And so were his eyes like physically like crammed shut? He just could never virtually open them, or what was going on here? But it's just kind of an odd story of this multiple having to do something, and then Jesus checks in, the guy says, and then Jesus does more stuff, and then the guy's finally like good. And then, as you were saying, Alan, then he's like, oh, I can see, everything's fine now. So obviously he was able to see at one point, because he can walk and do everything. He's perfectly fine after he can see again. That's just kind of an odd presentation of a story that is there anything else like that where Jesus has to do something twice to
kind of an odd ending to it too, and he tells him don't go into the village.
Yeah, he has to go back into the village, that Jesus dragged him out of. And so it just has a kind of a bunch of funny little details that I just couldn't quite wrap my head around. It's just too specific details and yet no real background story. A lot of times, Jesus will tell the disciples, well, I had to do this because yada yada. Nope, just one off, that's it. And I don't think this is quite repeated on any of the other gospels in the same way, this doing things twice thing. I just thought that was, anyway, we're just kind of there in that section of the chapter. Just thought that was kind of an odd one that just sort of stuck out. So I don't know, is there any deeper hidden meanings there that we're missing, or just...
I had my notes on my Bible say the healing of this blind man takes 2 attempts by Jesus, perhaps another indication that the growing lack of faith surrounding him affects his power. So, he may be getting discouraged by, the disciples going, well, what's going on? He's getting so exacerbated, he's losing his superpowers, but so yeah.
That would make sense though. Yeah. It's
But
right before that.
Like foretelling his death and resurrection, and it's like he has to keep saying that this is happening, it's happening soon. Wake up, they're clueless. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd buy that.
That might have been selective listening on the part of the disciples because they didn't want to hear that he was going to die.
Well, part of it is too, is that, I mean, for them, the idea of dying and being raised to life was not something they grew up with, that this is going to happen, right? Like most of us have heard it from birth, and even so, it's hard to believe. So them listening to it, they were probably just like, I hear the words, but I don't know what it means, right? I don't get this. I hear the words, but it doesn't make any sense to me. And I certainly have been that way in life, trying to envision things that somebody was describing it to me and I didn't understand it. And then when I experienced it, I went, oh, this is what they were talking about. Oh, okay, now I see. But it was outside of anything I could understand. And I wasn't even able to ask questions that were helpful because it was totally outside of anything that I could understand or imagine. So So that I get that they didn't understand that. And in 3 days I'll arise, and they're like, well, I got up this morning. You know.
In chapter 9, there's at 32, there's a verse that says, but they understood not that saying, and were afraid to ask him. So maybe they were afraid of his, somewhat afraid and in awe of his, what they saw as his power, or and I think it does make reference to them that they didn't want to really disclose what they were really thinking a lot.
Well, let's go ahead and look at chapter 9, because there's some good stuff in there too. I do think that when you're in awe of somebody and that you are wanting to, be close or impress somebody, then you don't want to look stupid by asking questions that should be obvious, right? So when Jesus, I'm going to be handed over to these people and I'm going to die and in 3 days rise, like going, again, I understood all those words individually, but it didn't make sense to me, but I don't want him to think I'm stupid, because he already said, don't you get it yet? So I'm just going to ponder on this. He keeps saying it, but I still don't understand what it means. And then the very next, right after that, Penelope, right after that, who is the greatest?
Right. That's that. And if you thought you had a dumb question, then you wouldn't ask that if you wanted to be the greatest.
That's right.
I'm sure his answer surprised him.
Very next thing is we're trying to one up each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably all of us have been in groups where that happens, and maybe most of us have even participated in one of those one-upmen, whether it's on how good you are or on how bad things are, or, because it's like, oh, I got a 96 on my test. Oh, I got a 97, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I was sick for 3 days. I was sick for 2 weeks, right? It's like always just a little bit more. It could be better, could be worse, but it's always just a little bit more, right? It makes it important, right? And so, yeah, you don't want to, if you're thinking that you're trying to be the one who's the most important, you don't want to ask dumb questions. Yeah. All right.
Right.
I think the blind man, when he touched him the second time, I think the first time he didn't have enough faith. And maybe because he saw the trees and, a part of a vision, that when Jesus touched him the second time, that his faith was enormous. And that's why his sight came back.
That's a great thought.
When I was part of the thing that I find interesting is the idea that he says, I see people, but they look like trees. And my thinking is, how do you know what a tree looks like? But David's saying maybe he became blind. Oh, well, that would be if you became blind. Now, blind people can walk. So the idea that he can walk around is blind people can walk. But if something happened, or he lost his vision, or he got, cataracts or something, and now he's blind, and so he wouldn't know what a tree is. Yes, I could see where people are, but they look kind of like trees. But when I was a kindergarten teacher, I had a child who needed glasses, and his mom took him to get his eyes checked, because they do those little things where you have to, right? And so they're like, okay, this kid needs to get a more serious eye exam done. So they discovered that he needed glasses. And so when they went to get the glasses, the prescriptions here, they got the glasses, they put the glasses on the child. This is a true story. And the child looked and he said, Mom, what is that? And she's like, what are you pointing at? That big thing right there. She's like, a tree? And he's like, that's what trees look like? So when I read this story, I'm like, I mean, this kid who he could see, but not very well, he had no idea. He just, it was a big blur for him. And so it's like, that kid didn't know what a tree was. How did you know what a tree was to know the people look like trees? But
Right.
maybe he couldn't see before. So yeah.
Just making a wild guess, but I'll bet they were fig trees. Just saying.
Probably.
Ongoing theme for me, the fig tree. So
Fig trees.
Do you have a fig tree at home?
no, it's just we get a lot of references to fig trees, starting with Adam and Eve. You know, the fig tree. But anyway, it all started there, and it just keeps flowing.
And if they don't produce, they're goners.
Shoot.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
All right. Anything else we want to lift up from chapter 9, or shall we go ahead on to chapter 10?
He's right at the very end of the chapter. This version has him saying, preserve the peace.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
This one, mine says, have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another.
Yeah, that's what mine says.
Mhm.
I like that, have salt in yourselves.
Uh-huh. That's probably a pretty close translation of the Greek. You know what having salt means to things, so that's probably a really very close translation from the Greek. The word salt.
This is one of the the temptations to sin. This is one of the areas where people this causes lots of problems, because people want to think that Jesus never exaggerated. He never used hyperbole, right? He never. So if if your eye causes you to sin, to rip it out. And so people have done this to themselves, but they've also done it to others. If your hand causes you to sin, chop it off. And so the disciplinarian will chop off the child's hand because they did something bad. And it's like, it's in the Bible. It's like hyperbole, people, hyperbole. I don't think Jesus actually intended for us to go around maiming each other. He was just saying, that to take seriously the damage that we cause, the damage that we do to ourselves, and by indulging that, the suffering we cause for others.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yeah.
Karen.
Hi, sorry I'm late. Bell practice went late. But yeah. Thank you.
When I was a young child, we used to go to Toledo Art Museum a lot, and they had stone carvings of the disciples, and like one of them was holding his head, right? So it actually showed they'd cut off their hands and their feet. And
well, the apostles, some of them were depicted in the manner in which they died. So Paul was beheaded. He wasn't crucified because he was a Roman citizen, so he was beheaded. Whereas Peter was crucified, but he had his cross put upside down because he didn't think he was worthy to be crucified upright. That was Jesus, and he knew his own weakness. So he asked that his cross be upside down and that he would be crucified like his master, but that it would be upside down. So you will see that kind of stuff too. So sometimes they depict that. Yeah. Yeah. I have a picture of when we were in Belgium. We went to a museum. We were looking through this museum, and there was this amazing carving, and this guy was holding his head, like, right, one of their saints holding his head. And so being as I'm a Harry Potter reader, I was like, oh, nearly headless Nick. That's
Oh,
but yeah. Yeah. We don't, in the Methodist Church, while the crucifixion is a central part of our faith, what we really celebrate is resurrection. So
Mhm.
our cross is empty. We celebrate that the power of love brought Jesus, returned Jesus to life, right? Restored him. And so our cross is empty versus other traditions that would have the cruciform, right? Would have Jesus on the cross and really emphasize the suffering that he bore, which also is very useful for instilling guilt in people, right? Guilting people behaviors, right? But so we don't have that cruciform, but then we get so sanitized that we kind of gloss over how many people were ripped to shreds by lions. They had their heads chopped off. They were tortured to death on a cross. I mean, especially when we gild the cross, we make it look like something golden and it's something beautiful. It's like, well, would we gild the rack where we stretched people, a torture tool? Like, it doesn't really make sense. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to avoid it, but I also don't want to make it like something that we think is beautiful. It's not something beautiful. It was something horrendous that was born for us, which doesn't make it beautiful. It still makes it horrendous what humans do to each other. The love is beautiful, and the love that raised Jesus is beautiful. But the device of torture, right? When we wear the cross as our symbol, an empty cross to remind us of the power of love, but it also reminds us, that the fullness of love brings suffering. It just does. But we clean things up so much, so it's really startling to see artwork with people with their head chopped off, and but that's what humans do to each other. We're really good at hardening our hearts in the name of love and hurting and causing suffering for the Prince of Peace.
How about
It's hard to believe that it still goes on today. In some countries, they still behead people. I just can't even get my head wrapped around that.
Okay, moving on.
Yeah,
How about the rich guy in the kingdom of God?
Yeah, that's a good one. That starts at verse 17 of chapter 10.
Yeah, kind of skipping over the whole divorce thing. It's oh well. Circle back on that one.
Yeah, I mean, that basically one of the things that is important to realize is that that when people would give their wives a certificate of divorce, many times they would be giving the person a certificate to destitution.
Right.
They no longer had to provide housing or food. Right. I mean, and think about it. It's not just that they wanted to marry somebody else because it's a polygamous society. They can go ahead and marry somebody else. Right? Monogamy came from Rome, not from the Jewish community, not from the Hebrew people. Theirs was a polygamous, so you could have another wife. You don't have to divorce your wife. You can have another one. So
the Old Testament was They talked about that specifically, that, concubines, wives, whatever,
That's right. So what does that really mean when they give them a certificate of divorce? Is just they don't want to take care of them anymore. So what's the woman going to do? Right?
That's interesting. Yeah. And that could, that could affect the elderly, or when they're sick, or, when they're most vulnerable.
Exactly. And so there's that aspect that in our day, in our country, women now are able to have jobs, own property, make decisions for themselves in many instances, not every instances, and not every state the same. But, so sometimes divorce is a thing that's beneficial for both people. But when you have one person who is powerless, and you say, well, I don't want you around anymore. And I'm not just blaming people, because, if you have somebody perhaps who's developed a mental illness, living in a household with people who have mental illness, that can be really draining. I get it. But now I no longer have to take care of you. Like, well, who's going to help this person? How does that work? And then the other side of it, he says, whoever looks at somebody with lust has already committed adultery. So the thing about adultery, I talked with a friend of mine who is an anthropologist, one of my colleagues, and she has done extensive work in Africa where there are still polygamous society, still a predominant influence. And so I asked her, what does adultery mean in a polygamous society? What are we even talking about here? And so she talked about that a little bit, but part of the thing here is that concept. If you look at somebody and you lust after them, you have reduced that person to an object, right? They're no longer a human. There's something that for you to own or control, something for you to find gratification for yourself, right? It's not about that other person. It's not about them being a human to you. It's about them being an object. And that's the problem. It's not if you fall in love with somebody, it's that if you're lusting after people, you are diminishing their humanity and creating them for them become an object to you.
Yeah.
Then if they're an object, then how many steps is that away from abuse? Right? Already. You don't need to do anything to promote their welfare because they're an object. So those are a couple of things that come out in that set of teachings. But let's go on down to this rich guy. The rich man, starting in verse 17. So David, what kinds of things did you pick up in this section?
It's kind of a somewhat repeated kind of, parable or story. And he's got a slight twist on it, because the guy, the rich guy, comes up and says, he says, good teacher. And then Jesus says, why do you call me good? It's like, Jesus is not good. That's interesting. Okay. And then Jesus says, no one's good except for God alone. It's like, okay, that's an interesting distinction that came out of what would have been, you thought it was going to go one way, and all of a sudden, woo, the story goes quite a different way. But then the guy sort of, presses the point. And then Jesus says the thing about the commandments, which is interesting because it just comes after, divorce. But that's another interesting, story. And then he says, the classic thing, I've done all these things, so am I good? Jesus looked at him and loved him. And it's like, that's another little twist. Looked at him and loved him. Okay. So in love, one thing you lack, he says, is go sell everything you have, give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven, and come to follow me. And of course, this guy has great wealth, and that's not going to happen. and goes on to say how hard it is for the rich to inherit the into the kingdom of God. But it kind of got me thinking about these shows. You ever watch any of these shows called Hoarders before? They're on
Seemed like an episode.
Netflix and things like that. And it's about these people who have a house full of stuff.
Oh, yes.
And it's usually basically just trash. It's not like, they have very expensive Ming vases and, things like that. It's just literally trash. But this stuff basically becomes their life, and they have little goat trails and how to get around all the stuff, and they prop it up, and sometimes they add stuff onto their house so they can put more stuff, or they have a tent in the backyard, or they tarp it over, and it's interesting because we think of ourselves as we own our stuff, but in many cases it's exactly the opposite. The stuff now owns us. And I was kind of sort of flipping that story around a little bit in my head about, we think of many of these stories as we get stuck in the physical aspect of these stories. And as we saw before about the, if your hand is, causing a problem, cut it off. It's like a metaphor, right? It's a symbol of something else. And so I'm wondering, we might take the story of the rich, meaning stuff, meaning maybe we're holding a lot of things in our life. We're holding these things, and we're holding on to things that maybe we shouldn't be holding on to. And we're creating shrines around certain enmities or certain biases or things that we think kind of define us, so to speak. We've got grudges. We've got, I remember I don't like that person, or this situation makes me scared, or we create buildings and houses and shrines out of all these things that we possess in our mind. And so when Jesus says, get rid of all this stuff and you'll be able to follow me. And so I'm kind of wondering if mentally we're sort of in that same place where we've got a lot of things that we're kind of holding, and those things are now owning us. We are not, those things are, we feel like we're using those things to define us, and it's the other way around.
Maybe that's why some people take vows of poverty.
I'm thinking maybe a mental poverty thing too, or you purposely say, oh, that person, made me mad 15 years ago, and I'm never going to forget that. And we're holding on to that, and that is now our property, our mental property, and we have a special closet that we keep that in, that kind of stuff. And so I'm just kind of wondering if maybe that's part of the things that we need to get rid of, are these things that keep us from moving on, so to speak, and you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven with all this baggage and all this crap that you've got in your your back closet.
In response to that, the disciples said, how can anybody succeed? And he tells them in verse 27, no chance at all if you think you can pull it off by yourself. Every chance in the world if you let God do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's explore it. Let's unpack this a little bit more. So there's kind of two threads going on here. So David's reading of it, which is a valid reading of using it to say, when Jesus invites us to give it all away and just focus on him, follow him. Yes, all our resentments, all of our disappointments, all of our need to validate ourselves by thinking we're the best, all those kind of things, they need to go away, because that's not helping us. It's clouding our vision. We're not really able to follow him while we're holding on to that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the other side of it, actually looking at the actual materialism and how many rich people, when you say give it all away and come follow me, that seems like an impossibility. One of the things that St. Nicholas was noted for, and St. Francis as well, both coming from very wealthy families, and they gave everything away and followed Jesus, and their lives were remarkable, and they changed the lives of many others. I will say that I personally have experienced both of those things. Both what Dave was talking about. There was a woman one of the congregations I served who wanted to be a wonderful person, but she really had way too many problems and a reluctance to deal with them. And she was known all over town for not being, like, when she would go into City Hall, they would not want to be the one at the desk to have to talk with her, sort of thing. And one day I was walking home, and as I do when I'm walking down streets where people live, or, you know, I think, oh, they're just over a block, I usually say a prayer for somebody, right? If I'm driving down their street, I say, oh, so-and-so lives here, or they just live around the corner, and I say a prayer for them. And I was thinking about her. It's just a block over from her house. And I was thinking about what a very unfortunate life she was leading. And I sat down on the curb, and I said, God, do I do this? Do I do these things that she's doing? Do I do this? And God's like, right here, right here, right here, right? Right. But on the other side, I said, God, I just don't want to. I don't want to end up there. And like, she was like maybe 40 years older than me. I'm like, I don't want to end up like that. Whatever it is in me, I would like you to take it from me now. And God did.
Wow.
And I would see people and I would think, I used to have a grudge against that person, but I can't remember why. And that, oh, how much better life is when you can't remember why that person made you angry. It was just, and part of it was, you know, leading up to this is like, I would have a grudge against somebody and nobody else would. Like, that person wronged me. Other people knew they wronged me and they didn't care. And I'm like going, I'm the only one who's being hurt by this. Nobody else cares. Nobody else's life. And I'm feeling not only sad by this person who hurt me, but now by everybody else who's forgotten how they hurt me, right? And then that's when I'm like going, God, do I do what this woman does? And God's like, right here. Oh, I don't want to end up like that. I really don't want to end up like that. And so I have a really hard time remembering how people hurt me, which is just so much better way to live. So that
very hard. It's very, very difficult.
Nice one. On the other side of that, on the material side of that, there's been several times in my life in which I mean, every time we're asked to move, like we're downsizing, right? We're getting rid of stuff. We're purging our house. We're getting rid of, when I went to seminary, I hauled everything out of my house and got rid of it, because it's not going to fit in a dorm room. It's not going to fit in my car to haul it across the country to the other, literally the other coast to go to seminary. So I got rid of everything. Do you know how many times I have to purge my house? It comes back. And this is part of the problem, that when people give away everything you have and come follow me, people think now I'm going to be destitute for the rest of my life. And I'm going to be out on the corner with my cup begging for money or something. It's like, it doesn't work that way. You give it away, more comes. It just does. More comes.
Unavoidable, really. Unavoidable, really. The stuff just,
it comes, right?
And the same thing is true of blessings.
Yes. So in 2010, in 2004, we were living in San Jose. We were living in the parsonage that came with my appointment. My appointment got changed, but my husband's didn't. And we needed now a new house, someplace to live. And so we were able to get a house in San Jose. And then, you know, in 2008, when things started to fall apart and the market started dropping, right? And then we got moved in 2010. Well, now the house is worth less than what we owe on it. Right. And so eventually we, not long, you know, as we're looking that we have to move, we're going to have money to pay for a house in Clovis, but that's not going to be enough to cover our mortgage in San Jose as well. We can't rent it for what we need to pay on the mortgage because values have dropped. So we ended up losing the house. And people are like, whoa, what did the bishop do to you? And I said, you know, the bishop didn't do anything to me. I gave that house to Jesus long ago. When Jesus said, give me everything, I gave Jesus everything. And, you know, I still have a house to live in. And what ended up happening with the house that we had we were able to find somebody who started a sober living environment. So men in early recovery had a community where they could go and live and learn how to live without drinking and how to do a whole new way of living. And eventually we ended up having a house here in Sonoma County, right? When you give it all away, you're not left destitute. God doesn't do that. You know, you trust God, you give it away, you go do what God asks you to do, and God is faithful. So both sides of that, whether you're taking it literally as finances or whether you're taking it more metaphorically as the baggage we haul around with us, I've experienced both of those in my life, and I will say they're both true. They're both very true. Very, very true. And so wherever you find yourself, wherever your biggest struggle is happening right now, follow Jesus. Just go ahead and give it away and follow Jesus. It's just a much better path. Just such a
11:25 kind of speaks to that also about
Okay.
when you start praying.
Okay, 11:25.
If you hold anything against anyone, forgive them so that your Father in heaven may forgive you your sins.
Right.
I am.
In my book, that's probably one of the top 5. Maybe top 3.
I really think a lot of good has come in the last few decades around the concept of forgiveness. I wish I could have gone to the event at the temple on Sunday, but I do know some people who went, and everybody who went has said it was a really powerful experience. John,
Yeah, it was amazing. I went and it was incredible, the stories that the people shared. It was really eye-opening in a lot of different ways. I don't need to go and expand on that, but since it's getting late, but
sometimes we hear things, well, often, almost always maybe, we hear things and we take it into our head and process it. This thing on Sunday, it didn't go to my head. It went to my gut. It went to my gut, and there was no way to process it. I just had to sit with it.
Right.
So it's a very different experience. It was amazing.
Amazing. Yeah.
it really helped me to look at people who are, you know, whatever, acting out or something, and to realize that there's a lot more that's going on than what I'm seeing. You know, they have a history, you know, so it makes me want to be a whole lot more compassionate and non-judgmental, you know, to people that are acting out, because it doesn't come out of a vacuum.
Jesus had a really great instruction in, I think it's 11:25.
Right.
Or 26. I urge you to pray for absolutely everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Good. Well, we are almost out of time now. It's right at 8. Does anybody want to have anything in chapter 12 they want to bring up? I do just a little bit facetiously need to point out the very end of chapter 12, when Jesus is watching people put their gifts into the treasury and comments on the widow who put in her 2 little bits. A little bit, like I say, facetiously, I try to remind people that Jesus wasn't impressed that she put in a little bit. Right? Like, putting in a little bit isn't the goal. Putting in your all. Putting in your all. So if you have plenty to put in, then put in plenty. If you
That's funny.
You got plenty to put in, it's not a goal to put in a little bit. It's to be all in. When you're all in, life changes, things change. Things change. Yeah. I want to say that a poor widow came and put in 2 small coins, which are worth a penny. So penny, I think you're worth plenty. I think if I made the offering that was the value of you, I think that God would be very pleased.
I hope so. I know so. Yes, I have faith.
Yeah.
My sweet Penny. Well, is there anything else before we go tonight?
And there is a verse in there in that last chapter where he says, God is God of the living, not the dead.
Yes. The discussion about resurrection.
Yeah. Interesting story.
Yes. Yes. Oh, there's lots of good stuff in here, isn't there?
Really, there
I
is.
love the way every time the Pharisees and Sadducees tried to trap him, he turned it back on everything.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. I thought it was I thought it was wonderful pointing out the hypocrisy that demand of Jesus. By what authority do you do this without being willing to take a stand and say about John's authority? Right? Just, well, if you're not going to be honest with me, then I don't need to arrest you. Go on.
And I'm kind of delighted at the fact that there's someone in the group from Iowa because we lived there for 10 years.
I got you beat there, John or Alan. I was born in Iowa.
I see.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, well, hopefully next week Rob will be back. Is there anything going on in our churches that we want to lift up? I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Anything in the churches that we